by saying, HR leadership and practice is incredibly complex. And as you all know, because you're like sort of living this dream, if you will, that it's changing very rapidly. So we're going to focus on the future. Now, I may not go to every panelist on every question. For the panelists, if someone's making a comment and you'd like to chime in, you'd like to add something, please feel free. We want to make this as interactive as possible. For the audience, if you hear something that you would be interested in asking a follow-up question on, raise your hand, and time permitting, I will go to you. If we get through this quickly enough, I may allow some time at the end for Q&A from the audience, once again putting you on the spot. So there was that period yesterday where it took about an hour till people started like sort of joining in. You're not getting that today. We need you to join in right now. Okay, so the first question, I'm going to go to Paul Daley. So Paul, it is more important than ever for a global company to communicate their quote-unquote employee value proposition, or EVP as it's called. All right, so EVP is a big part of the employment brand. Now here in APAC, where you have so many countries with so many different business and social cultures, how do you advise a client to localize their EVP, but making sure that it's globally consistent? So you have this global employment brand, the company, corporate headquarters wants to foster, but that value proposition has really got to be local to the business culture of the country in which it's in. How do you do that? How would you advise our audience to do that?
Okay, so firstly, excuse me for my voice. I seem to have picked up a bit of a cold. I'm not normally this husky. But a couple of points. Firstly, when we looked at the research that Korn Ferry FutureStep were presenting yesterday on what drives candidates, there was an amazing amount of consistency in that globally. The desire for career progression and opportunity for purpose, these were consistent really in all regions across the world. So I think when we talk about how do we make a value proposition locally relevant, we need to think about what elements is it that's going to engage a potential pool of candidates we want to talk to. And I think there's some very basic things that we tend to see time and time again. One is, how do we not offend local communities by having something that is going to jar or disengage them? So for example, if you look at career sites of many organisations that are global organisations, they feel very well attuned maybe to Western or US markets, but they really will not resonate in this part of the world. So just very basic things like the imagery that's used, the style of language that's used, is almost seen as a bit of a turn-off before individuals almost engage with that. So I think thinking about how you build touch points that feel relevant to a local community, whilst not worrying too much about the actual messaging in there, is one point. I think the second point is trying to talk about EVP as being a homogenous concept is quite a tricky one, because of the very nature of what you're trying to attract different people to do different things in different parts of the world. So we sometimes think about the concept of the opportunity value proposition. So the employee value proposition is, what does the organisation stand for at a strategic level as a business organisation? The opportunity value proposition talks about, what is it going to be for me, for the role that I'm considering in the country that I'm considering working for this organisation? And breaking it down to that level allows organisations to start to think about, what is going to be the message that we want to drive to that community, that group, that segment, that persona specifically, and what do we need to do that's going to give them some hooks or connection points that's going to draw them in? Because of course the goal of a EVP, or an opportunity value proposition, is to get people in a dialogue with you, from which you can then obviously tailor the content a lot more effectively. Those are just some initial thoughts.
Stacey, Agile One does a lot of work around the globe. What are you doing with your clients to make sure that they are globally consistent but locally appealing?
Yeah, I think the recommendations that we make and the conversations that we have is, the employee value proposition is sort of the subtotal of everything that makes your company appealing to a candidate. And so, we believe that it's important to have some very specific, common, general principles that are authentic in nature. I think that's key. But that reflect, the individual local markets. And specifically to Asia, what is important in mainland China is very different than in Japan or Malaysia. So we encourage people in those local markets, end users, to be a part of those conversations that drive those initiatives globally and locally.
Okay. So, in terms of, sort of the localization, is this a process that you actually would go into, sit down with the client and actually think about? Like, is there a document that says this is how we're going to communicate our employee proposition, and any of the panelists, in Vietnam versus in, let's say, Laos or Thailand or Indonesia, which right now has got a volcano problem, but, I saw the news this morning, and that's there. But how would you, do you guys document a plan with your clients to do that?
So for us, it's definitely part of our practice. It is, what's most essential is that the value propositions for the employees are reflective of the culture of a company. And so, we're not able to really understand what that culture is about until we really engage and interact with people on the ground. So, that becomes a part of our discovery process. Recommendations are made from a technology perspective, how we reflect the messaging in their website, in their social media communications, and again, we encourage local participation as a part of those discussions.
Okay. So let's move on to the next question. There's recent research, and good answer, Stacy. Okay, I'll put you on the spot there. Recent research by Harvey Nash Associates and NSAID determined that here in Asia, the study was done here in Asia, many millennials were concerned that they would be unable to find a job that fit with their personalities. Okay, now I want to make just one comment, all right? You never hear someone who's 26 years old use the word millennial. It's always, I don't know if you realize this, it's always old people like me or people from Gen X use the word millennial. Like, you never heard something, like, you never hear a 25-year-old going, yeah, I'm a millennial. They'll say, no, I'm 25 years old. No one describes themselves by generational cohort, and there's more similarities than people let on. So, but we've spent a lot of time studying millennials to discover that they're really a lot like older people in their views, okay? There isn't much difference. But this is one area where the world and the labor force, and you see this, is getting more entrepreneurial. They're more concerned about, if I don't fit in the corporate world, I'm gonna go out on my own, all right? And by the way, this was true of what's called the traditional generation, which grew up worldwide during the 1920s. When you see a lot of businesses spawn that are today major corporations, but were entrepreneurial shops. People talk about Silicon Valley, but Hewlett-Packard started in a garage in 1931. Okay, so this generation seems to be more entrepreneurial and less likely to just go to work for another company. So it's important that we all figure out how to appeal to people who have that instinct. So going back to being concerned about unable to find a job that fit their personality, what do you tell your recruiters about understanding culture and using that understanding, particularly understanding your candidate's culture and using that culture to identify the personality characteristics that align to cultural fit? So when your recruiters are talking to a candidate, understanding their personality and understanding the corporate culture well enough to make them match. So I'm going to go to Doug on that one, because it's really an easy question, and Doug said I need easy questions.
Thank you very much. Look, I think it's about having your recruiters really understand the culture of the organisation first and foremost. So when we, when we hire our recruiters to go on site with our clients, we make sure that ideally they have some domain or market knowledge so that they can speak the language of the business that they're recruiting for. But I think once they're on site, you have to go and give them a very comprehensive training program to make sure that they really kind of get the business. Further to that, I think that what they need to do is they need to really kind of get deep down within a business area that they're recruiting for and understand on the ground level. So that can be two things in my view. So one is make sure that they have very, very thorough briefing sessions with the hiring managers, and that's not just taking a job description and kind of going through as an order taker and then going away and putting out a job ad, etc. I think it's having a really detailed two-way conversation, consulting with the hiring manager. If the hiring manager is kind of off track with regards to cultural fit, or they've had problems with attrition before, or poor fit before, it's really kind of getting to the bottom of that and kind of advising on how they might do things differently. I think also further to that, it's about kind of really understanding who else is in that kind of department as well, and particularly at the kind of millennial or 20-something-year-old kind of level. So if your recruiters are inside a client and they know the people that are in the organisation and doing very well, then I think that they're better equipped to go out and find people from the marketplace as well.
All right. Do we have millennials in the audience? I know I see a few people who seem suspiciously millennial. Okay, you were not one of them. You are, aren't you? You're a millennial. Are you a millennial back there? That table right there. Any of you millennials? Come on, admit it. It's okay. We'll let you in the club. No? All right. Well, so I'm going to go to May night. So you actually do consulting on all of these issues around leadership, and you're not from the recruiting side of Korn Ferry Hay Group. You're from the I'm from Hay side of the Korn Ferry Hay Group. Okay. So what do you think about how would you recommend to your customers that they make sure that their recruiters understand culture well enough to do this matching to get people to feel like they're part of a potential organization?
I will probably look at it from a two-way approach. First of all is to look at the organization, how to make organization more agile in order to fit into the millennials' needs. And the other way to look at it is to develop millennials for them to take a more holistic approach for their career planning, for their culture fit. Statistics shows about 75% of people aged between 23 to 32 will prefer to buy things through machines. So the characteristics of this generation of people are very different to the last generation leaders. And we are seeing more and more people who are in their 30s or early 30s are going to taking C-level executive roles, which means they are driving changes, driving strategic initiatives for organizations and making a greater impact. And therefore their fit into the organization will have greater impact to help to drive results for the organizations. So in other words, companies need to be more agile in order for the millennials to fit in. And in addition to that, companies need to develop their future leaders, including high potential leadership, as well as existing leaders to help to move the transformation journey.
All right, where's that? He's taking a picture. All right, I was trying not to step out. Could you take the microphone over to this millennial that snuck into the room here? I just want to ask you a question, all right? Yes, that's what you get for raising your hand when you're asked a question. So, as a millennial, do you agree with NCI that is this something that's really a concern to let's say the folks you went to university with about why really fit, and is the frustration about agility and the speed at which companies move? Do you have an opinion on that?
I would say that definitely the culture is very important, and the fact that you want to be able to make change in your own work, but also, as I think it was mentioned yesterday, that it's important that you feel the company is doing things in terms of something good in any aspect, and to fit in as, I don't really see myself as a millennial, as you say, as well.
Right.
But I think in general, it is to just feel that you can, the company has to have a drive to develop continuously and to always, you have to see that more of a fast-paced culture where you have to be flexible.
Okay, so that's interesting, and you know, to your point about you don't consider yourself a millennial, one of the things, I have a son who's 21 years old, and he is technically a millennial, okay? So I'm genetically related to a millennial, I don't know, they're supposed to be very different. But his comment to me is the best way to tell if someone's over 40 is if they use that word. Right? And he was like interviewing in the workforce. He said if people use the word millennial, they're over 40. Right? But all the research that's been done hasn't really seen much of a difference. But this is an important thing, the issue about agility. And it dovetails nicely to our next question. Okay? Thank you. You can like run wingman for me in the future here, because the next question is about corporate purpose. Okay? And the need for corporate purpose. So one area that's being discussed in the realm of retention and engagement of the workforce is the company's communication of purpose. Like, why do you exist? A good friend of mine is actually the Chief Purpose Officer. It's a new role. It's only existed for 2 years, of PricewaterhouseCoopers. And Shannon's job is she reports directly to the global chairman, Bob Moritz, who's also a friend of mine, and she runs around the world. She spoke at one of our conferences this past year, and talks to PricewaterhouseCoopers associates about their purpose, which you say, well, they're an accounting firm. How sexy can you make that? But what they do is they make sure that investors and vendors and everyone's getting accurate pictures, transparent pictures of a company's financial well-being. That sounds a little more noble, doesn't it? But it took a while for them to actually think that through and say, you know, actually we serve an important social purpose. We prevent companies from hoodwinking investors and partners. So, purpose is defined as the reason for existence and their positive social impact rather than the actual business model. All right? So, what can your clients do to help you as their provider? What can the folks in the audience, the practitioners, help you understand purpose and communicate it with their candidates? I'm going to go to Cal first.
Thanks, Elliot. Yeah, big question, and an important one, I think, increasingly for us, actually, as an industry, because we are increasingly being held to account for retention. So it's no longer, for us, the partnership is no longer just acquiring talent, best talent for our organisations. We're actually on the hook for actually making sure they stay and perform, for that matter. So in terms of retention, I think really it's the same fundamentals that we know that apply here in terms of a really strong, well thought out communication strategy internally. So you can probably articulate that in terms of almost an internal EVP. How do you structure that? How do you communicate that to your internal organisation? And the connection here is that in fact where that communication strategy should really expand to is actually including your partners from the outside, because in a sense they are part of your business going forward, and that's kind of the way the world is working now. It's no longer kind of closed business systems. The idea that companies keep secrets, and to Elliot's point around really need to drive for more transparency in what is disclosed, not only to employees but actually to the marketplace, is the opportunity to develop that communication strategy, which becomes, in a sense, an engagement and attraction strategy at the same time. So I think at the very foundation of that, I think we still can't get away from the fact that, I think, as the saying goes, you know, culture and values will eat strategy for breakfast every day. So it's got to be built around, you know, that authentic culture and values that the business stands for. And I think everyone would have that in their mission and vision statement. They have a values statement. However, often it's discarded. It's kind of on their on your website, but it's not lived, it's not communicated, and it's certainly not illustrated on a day-to-day basis. So what we're finding more and more, and we do at Alexander Mann Solutions, we're heavily invested in this, increasingly so, is that we have a very much living, and I think to the point that was made before by our resident millennial, clearly I'm over 40, but is the transparency, but not only that is the evidence of being listened to. Listening to the employees and showing clear evidence that you're listening by the actions that you're also communicating as to what's changing and what's happening. So from that perspective, you then think about, well, from a communication strategy, how do you engage each, part of your workforce, whether that's by country or by function. So people like to communicate in different ways. So for example, we have a hugely popular WeChat channel for our China business. That is their preferred way of interacting within the business. And so all of the digital content, all of the community activities, everything that they choose to be a part of, that again connect directly to our values and fundamentally our culture, that's how it's communicated, and that then is integrated into Yammer, which is our global communication platform as an example, and that is done across the US, across basically around the world for us. But what you end up having is essentially a lot of communication and traffic going on every hour, every day of updates from around the world that really engage people internally to, one, understand our business, understand again the health of it, the challenges that we have inside of it, because we talk about everything. There's very, very few things we sort of taboo in terms of topics to talk about. It's not. It's supposed to be open. It's supposed to be again transparent. So for us, what we're finding is the feedback we get is from a retention perspective, is that these are the things that make the difference. And it's not. I think it's not an inexpensive or unfocused exercise. I mean, to Elliot's point, the idea of having a chief purpose officer, I like the title alone, but however, it really is in the realms of leadership and senior HR as a core part of your strategy for retention. And I think just to cover that off, our view is, we partner with many organisations, whether they're technology partners or in-country delivery partners where we need to. They tap into our communication plan. They have visibility on that, and that's how we are confident that when they're representing us in market, they know exactly what we stand for, they know exactly what's going on, and so we are comfortable that that is consistent, and so anyone who engages with us gets that same experience.
All right, very good. Nicole, how about from PeopleScout perspective, what are you doing to help your clients communicate purpose?
Well, the purpose piece to me is like the beginning of HR Nirvana, right? You start with your common purpose for an organization, and that flows through the rest of the organization in terms of your strategic objectives, how you measure, how you manage, how you engage an organization. And then clearly with an EVP, a differentiated EVP, your purpose can link to that. So if you have a really strong purpose, that becomes sometimes the unique differentiator that you can hold on to as an EVP. I'll give you an example. We have the opportunity to work with a client who is going through a bit of a turnaround, and we started facilitating with them, and we came back clearly there was no purpose that they were linking to. They were caught in this turnaround, they still are, and they clearly were not aligned to a common purpose. We started there, and the magic that happened after they determined what their actual core purpose as an organization was meant to be, the magic it created in terms of everything else flowing through the organization in terms of how their strategy linked to that purpose, how they went to communicate it, how they were going to engage their staff during a turnaround, and then also how they were going to communicate to the market to be able to attract the type of talent that they needed to help with the turnaround. Because not only was it a business turnaround, it's a cultural turnaround. So emphasizing that you have a common purpose is actually used not only for external recruitment, but for internal retention as well.
All right, thank you. This was a conversation I actually had with May before we started, and we were talking about things that are important. I recognize, because I've actually been in the recruiting world, that everyone is just suffocating to get that candidate to accept the job, to move on to close the next job. And you get stuck in a very short-term cycle. Some of what we're talking about, these concepts of being able to communicate purpose, is about an employment branding, for example. It's very long-term thinking. And you need to be able to give yourself headspace to do it. This is also, by the way, a very common problem all over the world, every region we visit. Everyone is just crushed by the volume of jobs they need to fill, and never has a moment to actually stop and say, well, wait a minute. If I could take more time to match people or communicate more effectively with people, and I know your providers want you to do this, and the providers sometimes don't have time to do it, we could probably retain more people longer and cut the number of openings we have each year. So, if you're in Bangalore, and your average tenure is 12 months, what happens if you get people to stay 2 years? Doesn't sound that great that you only get to keep people for 2 years, but think of how much money and time it saves the organization to just be able to do that. And on that note, we're going to talk about next recruiting for retention. This is a term that's come up a lot in our magazine and some of the articles that we have had contributed. And we just looked at one aspect, this idea of purpose and getting people to align to the mission of the company and its reason for existence. So this idea, this term of art that is coming into use, recruiting for retention, become a significant discussion everywhere on earth. Okay, but it's still a discussion. I don't know that anyone's actually figured out exactly what it means or how to do it effectively, though I think some companies do it better than others. So this discussion about recruitment for retention has occurred in other areas, but the growth rates of the economies here in Asia are significant. So what do you consider to be the best practice for recruiting for retention? And I'm going to go to Doug first on that, and then we'll go to May. So, Doug, how does the Legis Group, how does Legis Global Solutions help clients really recruit for retention, or do you? Or, you know?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, you do? All right, just checking.
Just to pick up on something you said there, I think you really need to take a longer term view beyond kind of filling the role that is immediately in front of you. One of the things we do in the talent acquisition function with one of our clients that I'm involved with, Credit Suisse, is lots of work on internal ability, and that kind of comes from the recognition that, you know, people do want variety throughout their careers, and they do want to learn new skills, they do want to move on, and perhaps it's not a linear path that they might take. They might move between different departments, etc. So we actually have a function as part of our talent acquisition team which focuses on internal headhunting, and we call it internals first. So we have people within the team that are focused on reaching out just internally to people, talking to them about their careers, and actually moving them through the organisation. And as an RPO provider on site, we're targeted as to how effective and how much we can actually do that. And I think that kind of takes a longer term view and keeps people with the organisation longer as well. On a slightly different tack, I think it's important to really kind of look at the data. So, you know, most talent acquisition functions will look at their data and look at what's, you know, the most effective sourcing channel to determine where to allocate resource, etc. So are they advertising on X job board, or are they, you know, investing in LinkedIn, etc., etc. But I think you have to look beyond that, and you have to look at what's been most successful after a period of time. So I think somebody mentioned yesterday, kind of looking maybe 1 year on at people's performance, and, you know, are the employees performing better, the ones that came from employee referrals, or are they coming from agencies, etc., and really kind of understanding that data. Likewise, if there's an early tenure attrition problem, I think quite oftentimes HR will have a really good view on why that might be, and, you know, even kind of get to the root cause of the issue. And there may be an issue around fit there, maybe cultural fit, etc. I think not often enough do HR, business, and talent acquisition kind of circle back and feed that back into the recruiting process. And I think that that's really, really important, because you know, there's no point going out to market and just recruiting the same profile again and again and expecting a different result. So I think, you know, along the lines of the theme of technology and innovation that we've been talking about over the last couple of days, I really think this kind of data and analytics is something that's really kind of, you know, going to be next, and you know, is not used well enough, and I think that's really going to make a difference.
All right, great. May, your perspective, you advise a lot of companies on
I would
that.
agree with that. I think you cover pretty much everything related to retention, but I will probably also add an organization dimension in there as well. I think getting the retention right is so important, because the cost for recruiting is high, and especially in this part of the world, we are seeing a lot of our clients are experiencing between a range between 30 to 50% of turnover, depending on the segment in the organization. Now, that is very expensive if you get the retention strategy right, that gives you a good return on investment. Unfortunately, the market doesn't really help with retention because there are some not very rational employers is happy to chuck the money out and buy what they need, because a lot of the large global companies are looking for this part Asia for growth stories, and the analysts and shareholders are looking for growth results. So bottom line is not always the best thing they have in mind, but when they realize there's a capability gap in the organization, they're happy to go out and buy. Now, the other way to look at it is that what can you do to help to be better at maintaining the people? And I think taking a holistic view to understand what is important for the future growth of the business. Is it front office? Is it sales and marketing? Is it risk and compliance? Is it middle office financial management? Is it, really understand how you build a talent roadmap. And once the people come on board, and then you provide a platform for them to feel challenged and fulfilled and really grow together with the company, that will help a great deal. And on top of that, I think individuals has different career motives. It's not everybody, I think, wake up in the morning thinking about, I'm going to make more money today. But I think that early on you mentioned about the bigger purpose certainly help, and be part of a successful organization and to take a journey together and build a successful story. That certainly go down quite well. I think this certainly is a challenge among many of our clients, is to looking at how do you provide a better platform for the people so that you do a better job with retention. That helps.
No, great comments. So we've been very strategic for the last few questions. I want to get a little more tactical into what your day-to-day life is. So let's talk about social media for a moment. LinkedIn, Twitter, Indeed, Weibo, Ren, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So what are the best sourcing channels that you see? Because there is movement. I mean, we talk about social media platforms that are, they sort of come into existence and then they sort of die out, okay? Or they lose some of their strength. So as it sits now, 2017, okay, Paul Daley, what are the best sourcing channels that you folks are using doing technology sourcing?
So before I answer that question, can I just go back a moment to the question on purpose? I just want a quick poll in the room. How many of the individuals here, off by heart, know the vision and mission of their organisation? Okay, so 10, 20% maybe. So that either means a lot of people don't, or we're still waking up. But I just want to point out something which I've observed as a bit of a trend more recently, and that is for organisations to move away from the idea of big corporate visions and missions to more of a notion around a mantra. What does it we stand for? And I want to call out an example of an organisation that we probably know around here, Tesla. Whenever I come here, Hong Kong, there's more Tesla cars on the road. And when you look at what Elon Musk talks about, his mantra is very clear. We will not stop until every car around the world is electric. Bang. And I think what I've started to see in the last couple of years is organisations really simplifying their purpose, what it is they stand for, removing the corporate mumbo-jumbo and just getting to the point. And I think that's really, firstly, clarifying who they are and what they stand for, and secondly, probably appealing to a broader audience that are now more concerned about transparency and really understand what it is the organisation stand for. So I just wanted to add that point, because it's certainly something I've personally observed. So back to your question
about Teslas, though, because they can sneak up on you and not make any noise. I don't know if that bothers other people, but it sort of bothers me.
So maybe the mantra should be electric car around the world that doesn't hit anyone.
No, all right. So I would like that better. I would like that better.
Maybe I'll let them know. I'll send them a note.
Yeah. All right. Good.
So back to your question. I mean, I think unfortunately I can't give a straightforward one here because it depends, right? It depends on the country. It depends on the role profile. It depends on the type of talent we're trying to attract. But what we've certainly seen is, depending on what good attraction channels look like, they always fall into two buckets. One is channels that create high desirability for an organisation. So there's a lot more channels nowadays that are about really positioning brand and creating awareness and building reputation. So WeChat is used pretty extensively for that in China. And then on the other side, there are channels that are more about reducing friction. So the ease of ability for individuals to find roles and apply to those roles. So classically, Indeed has probably been in that bucket, and increasingly Google for Jobs. Certainly in the US and other markets around the world will probably play that part. But certainly what we're seeing is an increasing proliferation of channels, an increasing need to utilize those channels for different purposes, sometimes in the case of building connection, awareness, and sometimes in the case of actually being able to pull talent and engage them and convert them into individuals that will probably just want a conversation. So I wouldn't call them applicants at this stage, individuals that just want to have the opportunity to learn more. So all of the above that you've listed on your question there, Elliot, apply, and I think increasingly it's a case of broadening that pool to drive further engagement with the segments you want to talk to.
Cal, how about from the AMS perspective? What are you seeing as the most effective channels?
Yeah, I think I've certainly aligned to what Paul was saying there in terms of the proliferation of channels. There's just so many, and there's so many emerging by country, by function. But I think where AMS, frankly, we're heavily invested in, where we're getting some great outcomes, is actually more around the idea of insight-led sourcing. And essentially what that speaks to is actually not so much the channels, but it talks to the emergence of more technology that actually goes and does your sourcing in a highly efficient way. So, and you can do that in an automated way. So if I give you the context, so it used to be that a recruiter would spend 70 to 80% of their time actually sourcing, literally going through LinkedIn, all the channels to try and find the profiles to then try and work out how to engage them. Where we see, I guess, technology taking us now, and what we execute on now in most of our clients is basically deploying technology like an Cielo, and it's a solution. So it's not one technology; it's a combination, depending on what market and what job category you're after. But essentially, what it does, and we've got a lot of case studies where essentially we can source for jobs in a matter of minutes, as opposed to a matter of days and weeks. And the reason we can do that is because of the availability of data and information. So tying it back around to sourcing channels, they really only form a part of the sourcing equation. I think really what we're focusing on is deploying technology that can automatically go through, whether it be use of AI and even some RPA in the background to keep driving processes, is to go to market, find candidates, because let's face it, finding candidates actually isn't the hard part, because the data's there. So the sourcing part of finding, really easy, and you can actually drive technology to do that really efficiently. And I think to a point Elliot made yesterday, where the smart sort of plays and where the investment really needs to be is where's the human element about making the conversion and getting engagement with the candidates you actually find. So from a sourcing perspective, so many channels, and again, these channels are now also realising that just having people's information is not enough. What value are they adding to that information? So again, this is where you'll see things like the job matching technologies, a lot of AI coming through sourcing channels that will say not only do people apply for jobs through my platform, but we'll match them, we'll add some value to that and actually kind of shape them into the roles that you want to hire for. So for us, I guess to answer the question for AMS, we're heavily invested in more the technology that helps us source faster in a more automated way, and equally invest more in the people side, or the experience side of what do you do when you've got that data to hand to engage the candidates and actually, I guess, effectively close the rec in terms of get the candidate engaged.
Well, all right, so let me ask you this, because your answer begs another question, which is, you have all these different potential channels. You have to, Paul, and you both seem to say, well, you need to use a lot of them. We have to add in the human piece, which I talked about yesterday. So I finally said something smart at a conference, which is good for me. But I'm curious, to do this would be, and given the huge crushing need, very expensive. So the question is, do you think that the CFOs and CEOs are giving enough financial and human resource to HR to accomplish its mission? Do you think they're getting what they need, or if they're not, where do they need more money? How do you feel like you're underfunded? Like you wish your CFO had approved a little bit larger, or a much larger budget for what you need to get done? really happy with the amount of budget you got? Any of you feel you're getting way too much money and need to send some back? How many people feel they're getting too much money? How many people feel like they're getting just the right amount of money? This cannot be possible in the market. How many of you feel you're not getting enough money? Okay, only a few of you. We don't live in a rational universe. Forget it, Caleb. I didn't mean it. No, go ahead. So where do you think the HR needs to really make the investments? Where if they were going to go and ask the CFO or CEO for more budget to accomplish some of the things you're talking about, where would you think that would need to be? And do you think they need it? Because they're not sure.
Well, I guess I'm yet to meet a client partner that is oversubscribed with money. But if you're out there, we'd love to meet you. So,
right, Paul, he got up this morning and said, how can I make more money?
Yeah.
I just want you to know that.
So, look, it's a big question, obviously. There's no straight answer to this. So I think really the expectation's got to be that HR's budgets are getting smaller. Because that just seems to be the right way. It's very difficult always for HR to make the case to get greater and greater investments. Safe to say, if there's a transformation where maybe there's a big piece of technology coming through, maybe it could be a workday implementation or something to that nature, which has a big investment attached to it. But interestingly, even in that context, if you look at talent acquisition from that perspective, often the business case is made by cost saves out of a talent acquisition function. So again, for one of our clients, for example, they've gone through a large global workday implementation, and the business case was actually $26 million out of TA to make the case to spend the money. The consequence of that is actually their process and ability to deliver recruitment has gone back by about 5 years in terms of what it's enabled to do, which again is a challenge because you now need to manage people's expectations to take it forward. So, but I guess to answer the question as best I can, I think where the investment for HR needs to be is probably in the area of evaluating the skills that HR requires to continue to drive an improved human capital service for the organisation through use of technology, adoption of new ways of working. Because what I do find is that HR tend to scramble to get budget to do things a lot the same in terms of infrastructure that exists and has existed for a long time, as opposed to getting budget to actually drive genuine transformation in the HR area. And certainly for TA, which again often is either sits on the side or is often not the champion cause in terms of what will attract the biggest budget. My sense is that if I was the head of HR, my ask of the CFO would be to get more funding into skill sets, whether it be IT skills and I guess process skills to help transform HR services that will then increase, I guess, the probability of actually delivering a service for less cost over time.
Stacey, how about that from Agile One's perspective? Where do they think HR needs to, make investments that it may not be making today?
So, very specifically from our perspective, the conversations that we're having are about building talent communities. Because if HR and, I know we always say we're underfunded, but if we really want to be a part of, thank you, the discussion about obtaining additional funding, it's to, commit ourselves to the dedication of bottom line and bottom line development through talent. So building talent communities, improving on employment branding, and then again, we talked a lot the last couple days about technologies and the evolution of those technologies and how they're growing faster than we can even research and report on them, but they are expensive. And a good technology implementation strategy is costly, but almost always has immediate return. So I think it's proving that business case. And then lastly, I think one, fundamental gap that almost all companies that we're talking to experience is the lack of training as it relates to hiring managers and then end user engagement. So, basically what's lacking is, the art of employee engagement. HR, talent acquisition utilize resources and, you know, partner with the right companies, access technologies, but when it comes down to a hiring manager having important discussions, what they say in that room is the success or failure of the overall effort. And there needs to be some strong training, and there's a cost associated with that.
All right, so you mentioned some of the things we talked about yesterday, keeping pace with that. I want to go back to, you know, yesterday we talked about some of the things that are disrupting or enhancing or changing the practice of HR, specifically as it relates to talent acquisition and somewhat as it relates to engagement. These things are, you know, gamification, artificial intelligence, chatbots, gig economy, so on, predictive analytics. They're all sort of disrupting HR right now. They're all coming into the, you know, what do we use from analytics perspective? What do we do? Do we deploy a chatbot? Do we not deploy a chatbot? Okay, so we talked a lot about these things yesterday, all right? You know, good deal today was sort of understanding what is the current state of technology that is available, not even deployed. It's not deployed yet, but available. Let's go forward. Let me put some folks on the spot. What's going to be the big issue in 5 years that we're going to be talking about when gamification is just so 2010s? Okay, and we need to be in the 20s. Right? Bring yourself to the future. All right. So what's the next disruption that you think is coming? Okay, and it might be that, well, gamification will be used by everyone. I'm gonna, you know, it might be something that we haven't thought of or talked about yesterday. Nicole, from your perspective, what's the next big thing?
So the next big thing, I mean, when thinking through this question, I think it's very interesting that you have to see what progress has been made in the past 5 years in different areas of the world. Before I go there, you know, I would challenge that if you think about what they're trying to crack in terms of robotics today is the human emotion, the human element. So they've got the automation piece kind of on its way. They've got a lot of the intelligence on its way. As you mentioned yesterday, Facebook had 2 robots who developed their own language to talk to each other. They had to shut them down. It's pretty scary, right, when you think about it. So if we can crack some of that human emotion through a robot, then what does the world really look like? And what does recruitment really look like? So we saw a robot that was in a school. You say, well, that robot cannot replace the teacher. But yet, this robot was answering a number of the questions of the kids. It could sense the emotion and whether they were distressed or not. And it would ask a question around the distressed nature of the child to hopefully settle it down while a busy teacher was trying to handle a classroom of 30 kids. And it was fairly successful. It wasn't like Elliot's example, where he shared with me yesterday that he managed to ask a robot a question that sent it into a spiral and shut it down. So, you know, we might see more advancements because obviously the human nature is to try to crack the impossible. So if the human nature is to try to crack the impossible around having robots figure out emotion, at what point is that injected into the recruitment process, especially when you've got a group of candidates that are coming up that are actually intrigued by engaging with technology. So who knows what role that will play. But we might actually see a trend back to the human element, that we need to see more involvement from, you know, those that can innovate and be creative around the process to engage, because we're going to be in a competitive state on talent. Everyone's going to try to make their EVP differentiated. Everyone's going to try to make sure that they're retaining talent, and yet, and this is going to the second part that you asked around the gig economy, how advanced will that be? How much control will the candidate actually have? And in what regions will that be the case? Because even looking at it today, that's much further advanced when you think about North America versus Asia on the gig economy is probably just starting. The laws around what that looks like and how to manage that are advanced in some countries and not in the other. So only 5 years from now, Asia may look like the way the North American countries look. So I would suggest that, you know, back to, again, what we were talking about yesterday, is that there's still a lot of ambiguity in 5 years' time. We're going to know a lot more. We're going to have a lot more data. We're going to have a lot more insights into that data that are handed to us. We're going to have gone through a learning process of how to interpret that and know what our role is and where we still need to play. But then by that point, how far advanced the technology is going to be. Gamification will be virtual reality by then. So.
All right, all good points. So now I got to explain the story about the robot.
Yeah.
So I was at a conference in Singapore, and it was a Japanese company that developed a robot that they named Andy, because the underlying interface system was actually Android technology that they had adapted to interface with humans, but there was a very sophisticated back end of the system. So Andy, they said to me, you can't confuse it, you can't trick it, and once it learns something about you, it will use it to interpret all of your future communication. And they said, Andy is far more logical than a human can be. So I was actually on stage when they were doing the demonstration. So this was, I'm not a big believer in some of this stuff, but Andy was very smart. Andy had been taught what they call the facial action coding system, and it was reading my pupil dilation. So it like asked me my name, and I said, my name's Peter Carvalho or Caleb Baker, and said, I don't think that's really your name. They could tell when I was lying. And you think about how powerful that would be with a candidate, because candidates lie, and we all know that. So, but then he said, but you can't, you can't, and you won't get confused or messed up like a human recruiter can. So I said, great. Andy, I want to tell you something about me that you can incorporate into all future interactions. He said, what's that? I said, Andy, I'm a liar. I lie all the time. And he goes, okay, like that. And I said, great. I'm going to tell you a lie. And Andy sits there. And I said, now, and I said to the audience, now Andy's sitting there going, well, if you lie all the time, and now you say you're going to tell me a lie, then you're telling me the truth. And you could watch the screen start to lock up. And Andy could not cope with this logical conundrum. So the guy who was co-presenting, he was a good guy, and he starts laughing, he says, well, that's a new trick. I said, I actually saw it in a Star Trek episode in 1967. Okay, so it's not actually a new trick. So the computers are not yet there because humans can still be more logically agile than they are. You can create ways to confuse a computer. So to your point, I had to tell the story, but I got to tell you, the technology is not there yet, but it also ain't that far away. Right? I was actually having a natural speech conversation with this, and it wasn't a physical robot like Pepper, that Zach was talking about yesterday. It was actually just like a laptop with a camera, and it had like a fake face on it that was talking to you, but it was very, very effective. But Andy never seen Star Trek and wasn't ready for me, okay? So Andy met a bigger geek than a computer, and that was the end of Andy, okay? He crashed, he had an app crash, all right? So on this topic of the next big thing, Paul, Cielo, you've got the Sky Labs, I think that you call it, the innovation in technology, which is a big part of your value proposition. What do you guys see as the next big thing 5 years from now? What are we going to be talking about?
Sure, so I guess just to answer that in a moment, but just to offer a bit of preamble. There's this interesting interview that Jeff Bezos had a while ago that was talking about what is the question that I tend to get asked by analysts time and time again. And that question was, what do you see that's going to be different in 5 or 10 years' time? Kind of question you expect to ask the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? But he said the better question he gets asked is, what's going to stay the same? Because you can't build a business on stuff that changes all the time. And for Amazon, no one's going to turn around to them and say, I love your business, but can you just deliver it a little more slowly and charge me a bit more? No. So they know that driving down cost, choice, speed is what's going to drive their value going forward. So I think when we apply that to our world of talent acquisition, we know that the things that are going to be ubiquitous in the future are, can you bring me better talent? Can you bring me better talent faster? Can you bring me better talent that stays? So we think about 5 years or so out, what are going to be the capabilities that are going to be solved for that problem? And I'm just going to offer 3 ideas. The first one's a bit boring, and I'm going to end out with one that's a bit more wacky. The first one.
Don't end with the boring one.
Yeah.
We're almost done. Not with the boring one. Go ahead.
So the first boring one, see what you feel, is around the idea of data protection, data privacy. And it's boring because nobody wants to think about it, but it's also pretty important and increasingly important because we're seeing what's happening out there in the world. You just read over the weekend what happened to Equifax. They're not the only one that's recently fell victim to issues around data privacy and data protection. And as the complexity of what we do and the ability for us to capture data on people becomes ever greater, the risk of getting that wrong also becomes greater. So I think that's going to be something we're going to hear about as a topic in 5 years' time for sure. The second one is around tools and capabilities that actually solve for quality of hire. And by that I mean being able to use people analytics and big data to answer the holy grail question of what does a good hire look like, what are going to be the hires that are going to really deliver value to our business. And we've seen some glimmers of that. Certainly in our organisation, we're getting there with a number of customers, and we are increasingly recognising value in the way that we partner with them on that component of, are we hiring you good people, are we hiring good people that stay? And the third one is really a link to what you're raising, Elliot, there around the idea of robots, and maybe linking that to the concept of the gig economy and the freelance workers. There's a firm in, I think it's Japan, that have just started up, and they offer resources to do jobs. Sounds like a temp agency, right? But rather than offering people, they're actually renting out robots. So a retailer, for example, can say, I'm running a promotion, I need some more people to promote our product. Here's 20 robots, we're going to rent them for you for a month, and away you go. So I just wonder whether maybe that's going to be the future of the staffing industry. Not renting out people, but renting out robots.
Interesting.
Good. Elliot, can I just add one more concept?
Yeah, sure.
In addition to all that, which is very, very good, the one thing too that's happening in conversations, and this would be interesting for all of you to have with your own organization, is what happens to the skill sets of the future? What happens? We may have large skill sets that are displaced. What are government's obligations to protecting those jobs? So these are the conversations that are starting to happen around what that impact of robots doing jobs, which is not necessarily talent acquisition. If we're recruiting robots, that'd be interesting. But it's a bigger issue around how does the skill set shift in the next 5 years, and what happens to those that we were talking about yesterday that are digital migrants versus digital natives, and how do they operate, and what does that mean in the future for roles, and what does it mean in terms of obligations for making sure that we're upskilling all generations to be able to handle what's coming.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that point's really well made, and I just want to share an example actually for Alexander Mann Solutions. So some of you have been to some of our sessions will know we already have 6 robots deployed in our service centres around the world, of which we have 7. But to the point, the robots are deployed around very, repetitive back-end processes, interview scheduling, document management, these sorts of activities. So the way that translates for us currently is, we have about 3,200 people in our centres around the world. The robots do the work of around about 12 people's output per month, and they do that in about a day. And what it means to us, though, is the way our workforce, and it really speaks to Nicole's point around our whole development of people, the skills we need, is already shifting at quite a pace in terms of who we're now hiring, what we're now training our kind of recruiters on, who are actually no longer really recruiters, more specific sources, whether they're high volume, whether they're specialist sources into professional level hiring. What tools are they using? What do we need to train them on from that perspective? Not what I'd regard as traditional recruitment activity or skills. That is already kind of in our infrastructure, and I would imagine it's in most people's line of sight and coming through. But that's just today. But I think to the whole, what are we going to be doing in 5 years' time? I actually wonder whether we're going to be calling it even recruitment anymore, rather than just talent relationship, community, or something in that realm, because I think technology, we're doing a lot of the activity that we know as recruitment, and the role of the recruiter, whilst not redundant, will be fundamentally different for what it is today, I think.
All right, thank you. We're out of time. So one thing I know will not change in the future is Zach Misko will not send you to a networking break without an assignment or an exercise. So I'm going to get Zach up here in just a moment to do that. I want to thank our panelists, Caleb Baker, the Managing Director of APAC and Emerging Markets, Alexander Mann Solutions, Nicole Cook, the Managing Director for Australia and New Zealand for PeopleScout, Paul Daley, Senior Vice President of Cielo, May Knight, the Managing Director for Korn, Ferry, Hay Group, Doug Terry, Account Director for Allegis Global Solutions, and Stacy Habiger, the Chief Sales Officer for Agile One. There is a lot of great points that I'm sure you'll talk about during the break. Big round of applause for our panelists.